Well, it might not be pretty, but it sure is my favorite dessert. And to start off this apple pie, we're going to first make our crust. And to start the crust, you're going to want to freeze your butter. As you can see here, this butter has been frozen, and I'm just going to roughly cube it up. And once I'm done cubing it, I'm just going to throw it back into the freezer while I get my dry ingredients together. Now for the dry ingredients here, we have some all-purpose flour, some sugar, some cinnamon, and some salt. Of course, all the amounts will be written down into the description, and I'm going to give this a really nice whisk. You're going to want to make sure your dry ingredients are nicely mixed together. And after I'm done mixing them together, I'm going to throw them back in the freezer. This is because you want everything to remain as cold as possible. This pie crust really relies on the butter being still solid and cold right up until baking. This is going to cause the butter to puff up, giving you a nice texture for the apple pie crust. So I'm just going to take my frozen butter and toss it within the flour, not really concerned with breaking it up too much yet, just making sure all of the butter is nicely coated in the flour. Then I'm going to take the butter chunks and slowly smush them in between my fingers, creating little tiny layers of butter and flour. This is going to get a really nice flaky texture. And normally I use my hands for this entire process, but I did just buy this baking tool that I think will help me along. And don't feel too bad if you have to throw it back in the freezer. I do multiple times throughout this process. Just if you ever start feeling the butter get too warm and start to melt, you're going to want to throw it back in the freezer. Now I'm going to get all of my wet ingredients together, making sure everything is as cold as possible. And here you can see I'm using Everclear. You can use whatever type of alcohol you want. Again, the amounts are going to be down in the description. I just like to use Everclear because of its high alcohol content. That's going to keep the gluten from not forming in this dough, which again will give you a really great texture, flaky texture. And once I have it all mixed together, I'm going to press it down into my parchment paper to try to form a solid mass. And here is where I'm actually going to fail a lot. I did not hydrate my dough enough, and as you can see here, it's going to fall apart and crumble apart. This is why I'm going to get the undesired effect that I'm going to at the end of this. But there's nothing I can do about it now, so you guys are just going to have to watch me struggle with this super dry dough while I try to work it into a pie crust. And I put it in the freezer a bunch of times just to make sure that it remains cold, because the butter did start to kind of melt on me a bit. I guess I would have what they would call hot hands, so make of that what you will. Now, after struggling around with this super dry dough, I do finally get it into somewhat of a consistent shape, at least enough to cut it. So what I do here is I cut it now usually into fours, and I stack them on top of each other and give them a really solid press down. This is going to create more layers of butter and flour. The more layers you create, the puffier it's going to be and the greater the texture. I'm not looking for like a bread type of texture, I'm more looking for a really flaky texture, and this is really going to help you achieve that. Now this kind of layer making between butter and flour kind of calls back to when I was making the croissants and I was using lamination techniques. But I generally like to do this step around 3 to 4 times just to make sure I get a lot of layers built in. Then I'm going to cut the dough in half because this recipe does create a top and bottom crust, and I'm going to just fold it into a circle, at least the best that I can, because it'll help us during the rolling out process, and I'm going to freeze it until it's ready to be used. Now let's talk about apples. Here I'm going to do about a 50-50 blend of sweet Pink Lady apples and Granny Smith apples for the sourness. And you are going to need a lot, just about 4 pounds worth of cut up apples. And the upside with Pink Lady apples, if you can find them, is that they stay nice and firm even after baking. I can't tell you how much I dislike an apple pie when the apples on the inside turn into just like an applesauce mixture. I'm not a fan of that. I like my apples to stay nice and firm and crunchy. And that's also what they have in common with the Granny Smith apples here. And you can use whatever technique you want to cut up and dice your apples. Here I'm showing you two where I use this ball ice cream scoop thing here to core them out, and then I cut them into about 1/4 inch thick slices. I like my slices to be a little bit thicker just because, again, I want them to remain solid in during the baking process. And after I have my 4 pounds of apples cut up, I'm going to transfer them into a very large bowl and get my spice mixture together. Now, the spice mixture is going to be written down into the description below, but I do want to point out that I am using a good amount of ginger in this. I think ginger is an amazing spice, and you should incorporate it into your apple pies if you aren't already. Trust me, it's just going to make your apple pies that much better. And after mixing together my spices and sugar, I'm going to then take them and sprinkle it all over the cut up apples. Oh, and if you're a little frightful of having brown apples from oxidation, you can also sprinkle them with a bit of lemon juice. This will keep them from turning brown. But because I'm going to be baking them in an apple pie and they're going to turn brown anyway, I don't really care too much about it. Now I'm going to transfer my sliced up apples that have been sugared and spiced into a large colander. This is because the sugar that I added into these apples are going to actually draw out moisture from them. This is called maceration. And I'm going to put that large colander back into the large bowl because I do want to collect all of those juices. Now on to making the apple gravy. Here I'm just going to combine our apple cider, lemon juice, and vanilla extract. In the recipe I say you can use a vanilla bean, but I didn't have one on hand, so I'm just going to use vanilla extract. Now I'm going to simmer this liquid down along with any juices that I've collected from the sitting apples. And again, I'm just going to cook it down, throw in some cornstarch to get it nice and thick into this really amazing apple gravy. It's going to smell amazing. Try not to eat too much of it because you're going to want most of it in the actual pie. Now I'm going to toss it with our apples, and I'm going to take our apples and I'm going to throw them in the, little snack for me. Now I'm going to take them and throw them into the freezer just to make sure everything is as cold as possible. Again, even in the assembly stage, we want to make sure everything is cold. And I'm going to take my badly formed dough and try to now shape it into a pie crust. And at about this point, I did kind of start to realize that this dough is definitely way too dry, but at this point, it's too late, so you just got to work with what you got. But as you can see, we still have a lot of beautiful marbling of butter in this dough. That, of course, is going to give it a nice flakiness. Now, of course, at this point, you're going to have to make the decision as far as which one you want to be the bottom and which one you want to be the top. Of course, I'm talking about the apple pie. So just pick the dough that you feel like you can roll out the best and it'll look the best after it's done baking. And of course, if it starts to get too warm while you roll it out, just throw it back in the freezer for about 5 minutes just to let it cool back down. And now I'm just going to use my pie plate to show me how far off I am or how much further I need to go with the rolling out. And just a pro tip, freeze your pie plate. This will of course keep everything colder for longer, which will give you more time to work on everything. Now I'm going to lay my pie crust into the bottom of the dish. Also make sure you butter your pie dish. This will make everything a lot more non-stick. And you're going to want to make sure you press everything in all the way. That way there are no possible air bubbles. Now I'm going to start to layer in all of the apples, and at first it's going to seem like too much, but trust me, they're going to cook down, so you're going to want to use all the apples that you have. Now I'm going to throw the top crust on and crimp down the edges. Make sure everything is sitting very nicely. Again, try to get out any type of air bubbles or any just type of voids. And now I'm just going to use a really basic egg wash, just an egg and some milk that I've splashed together to make sure the edges are nicely sealed together. Because trust me, you don't want any blowouts, especially with any apple juices falling to the bottom of your oven, because trust me, the smell of burning sugar at the bottom of your oven is something that is truly horrific. Now I am just about the furthest thing from a food stylist or even a food decorator, so as you can see here, I keep my edges fairly simple, and I'm just going to go around with a fork just to make sure it's all nicely crimped together, and I'm going to throw it back in the freezer just to make sure it gets nice and cold again. Now I'm just going to take that same exact egg wash that I used to crimp the sides down, and I'm going to very much liberally brush the top of this pie. This will make sure there's going to be a nice even browning throughout the entire top of the crust. And now for another really important step, cutting the vent holes. And you can of course do this in any stylistic way you want. Again, not a food designer or stylist, so I'm just going to do it like this. And of course it's optional, but you can sprinkle some coarse sugar, raw sugar, Demerara sugar on the top. This is going to make it nice and shiny and really give it a really good texture. After preheating my oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit with the sheet pan in there, I'm going to throw the pie on top of the sheet pan for just about 5 minutes. Then I'm going to reduce the heat to 375 and then do the long bake for an hour and a half. And of course, another pro tip, if you want a super duper shiny top crust, just brush it down with some corn syrup right after you take it out of the oven. This will make for an ultra shiny top. And after about an hour and a half of baking, without further ado, here is the pie. And I say that a little trepidatiously just because you can see the top has kind of fallen apart, kind of cracked everywhere, and just turned into almost like a crumb top. And this is because I did not hydrate the dough properly. So Well, it doesn't look that great, but I can assure you it tastes absolutely amazing. Now, after not letting it sit long enough, I'm going to try to serve it, and as you can see, it's very much soupy. This is because you want to let the pie sit for at least a half an hour up to an hour, if you can, just because that'll help everything on the inside re-solidify, and that's how you'll get really nice slices. So was this, after all, a failed recipe? Well, you guys be the judge. Tell me in the comments section down below. Again, tasted amazing, but just didn't look the way I had wanted it to. So maybe I'll redeem myself in the future by making another apple pie video. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook for some behind the scenes looks, as well as a bit of a look at the recipe development process. And peace.